Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur. As women journalists, we often face discrimination and harassment on the job. Although many barriers have fallen, many more remain. The challenge is not just to open up the field to women professionals, but also to change the way we report the news, including women's voices and perspectives on major world events. To talk about that challenge, we're very pleased to have with us today Mirta Rodríguez. Mirta is a pioneer in the field of gender and communications, a journalist in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Ecuador. She's reported all over the world, including a gender perspective in her work. Mirta, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Mirta, to start off, I want to ask you something that I'm sure is obvious to you. It's been your life's work, but that many people still don't get. Why is a gender perspective important in communications?
I think it's enormously important, but not just for communications, also for democracy. You can't have democracy without gender equality. And you can't have gender equality if you don't have a gender perspective from the point of view of communication. That's my point of view, at least.
When you began this work, there were very few people who were doing this kind of work in Cuba or really any place else within the region. How did you get started?
Well, I started in 1997. No, it was 93. I got together with a group of women communicators in Cuba, and we were unhappy with the ways that it was talked about. For example, the image in Cuba, which is similar to how it is in many other countries. I'm not saying this is specific to Cuba, but I'm talking about the year 1993. It was first, the people on the screen were white, and they were male. So we formed this group of communicators, all very brave women, but also very professional. I could talk about so many of them. We realized that we had to do something. So we got together in a group that, well, at first it was looked on with a little suspicion because, well, but we were all women with a lot of prestige in our different professions. Television directors, filmmakers, all very respected women. We formed something called the Association of Women Communicators. And from there, we started working on the gender perspective. We started publishing things, writing reports, getting people together, and it just started growing and growing like you couldn't believe. When we looked at how many people came to our workshops, I'm telling you, 200 professional women and also non-professional women, because we also say that communication is everything that is produced as a message. So that means if there was a doctor there who works with women, that was part of our mission. Lawyers, other professions. And it just grew and grew, and I'm telling you, our workshops, I remember that the first one was about sexism in language. That had never been talked about in Cuba. Everyone always talked with masculine terms, and they still do, in Cuba and in a lot of places too. But we started to work on the issue of language, because language is a message too. Language is ideology, language is politics. So that perspective, well, we started to call it a gender perspective. We didn't have a clear political association, because some of us were feminists, but not all of us. And some of us said no, that they weren't feminists, because it was a taboo at that time.
They just reject the term.
The way it was talked about in our culture, that being a feminist is a very bad thing, or who knows, it means you're against women or something. But we didn't have any problem with men or women. So, well, it kept growing and growing, and we ended up giving lots and lots of workshops.
Well, when you say that at first there was an attitude of kind of reluctance, Was there resistance? What was the resistance to the organization of women in the media and to the idea of having a gender perspective?
Well, there was so much resistance that after 3 years, we couldn't do it anymore.
Really? What happened?
They called us from the party and they said that the right thing isn't always appropriate and that they didn't need this because everyone is equal. That's false. We weren't all equal. And they hadn't understood anything. So we started to work on the issue openly, inviting a lot of people to participate, a lot of people, including men. Some men came to our workshops.
And you've been part of the revolution since the very beginning, so they couldn't exactly question your revolutionary commitment, right?
Of course, that's the thing, that we had a lot of prestige as professionals, but also as revolutionaries. Every one of us, we had the ideals to fight for, and we fought for them.
Oh.
Really, we were fighters. We had worked underground, for example. I spent time in prison, and there were other women who had such revolutionary histories that it was very hard to criticize them.
So you fought in the revolution?
Of course, yes, of course. So it was very hard for them to go against us. But even then, they tolerated us up to a point until they decided that we were getting in the way of official policy.
And how did you react? What did the group do? Did they disband?
Well, look, that was a very traumatic thing because the Central Committee called us to explain to us that it wasn't a good idea, that the enemy was trying to seduce the people and even the revolutionaries with things like this, like, I don't know, offering trips, or I don't know what. We didn't have anything to do with that. So the youngest ones out of us decided that we had compromised too much, and it got uncomfortable because we should have resisted that imposition. But some of us, the older ones, who'd gone through the experience of working underground, and we knew a lot about what was going on, we knew very well that if we resisted, we would become, or they would make us into dissidents. And no, because we are revolutionaries. We still are, of course. We love the revolution. We participate in it. We want that. But that's how it happened.
Have things changed now? Is there more room within Cuban society to have initiatives like this?
Look, now, if I talk about gender, gender is talked about, and it's an effort to open up a space for equality. But it's not really well understood. Well, that gender is, and of course, we don't really understand what we can do with that. So the question kind of goes unanswered, but at least it gets talked about, at least.
Yeah, that's progress anyway. In some ways, we're having the same discussion here in the sense that in the media, for example, in Cuba now, you see a lot more women. You see a lot more women in the media everywhere. And so now it's a question of parity, the presence of women. Is that the same as a gender perspective? Because there are certainly women who are not feminist who are in the media.
No, of course. But a lot of talented women are getting involved, and men too, of course. A lot of women are getting into media, are trying to do new things. They are doing them. But there's still a small minority in the context of the big picture of communication. But at least there are contests, there are juries, there are things like, for example, the Writers and Artists Union has a section where these issues can be talked about, the Journalists Union too. We're moving now towards a better situation. I mean, that's what I think. We don't know.
And have you seen more or less the same situation and the same evolution in Dominican Republic and Ecuador, the other countries you've worked in?
Well, in the Dominican Republic, I would say that it is a little more open. In Ecuador, not so much. Because Ecuador, I was only there for a year, but I was in the Dominican Republic for several years, and I even helped create the Dominican network of journalists with gender perspective, made up of women and men. And well, in some respects, we're making progress.
Looking at your work, it's not just a question of women being identified as women and being pro-women's rights within the media, but also the way you tell the stories. You look for the stories that women tell about major events. Is there something different about the way that women experience major world events or talk about major world events from, say, interviewing the men involved?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a categorical answer for that, Laura, because it's not easy to determine anything that's so subjective.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that yes, that things are going that way.
For example, when you cover natural disasters, you won the Mary Fran Myers Award for gender and disasters for working on the earthquake in Haiti. When you cover those kinds of things and you seek out the stories of women, do you get a different point of view?
I think so, that we have a different point of view because when you look through a woman's eyes, but also with eyes that already have a gender perspective, you see the gaps that society, even democratic society, leaves, and the need for a different perspective. When I reported on what happened in Haiti, of course there were things that I saw that other people didn't see. In general, because of the reports that were being done about Haiti, I looked at women who experienced that disaster. I saw a girl who was looking for her mother's hand in the rubble, hoping to recognize it by her ring. That's the kind of thing that I reported, that I wrote. And it was those stories that, thanks to my colleagues from Catalonia, from Barcelona, they were entered my stories into Mary Fran Myers contest. And of course, I was very proud when I got that prize. I was very happy because, well, it was a recognition that the image of women who struggle in the midst of a disaster had to be recognized, and it was recognized. It wasn't me. It was those women that I talked about, women and men, but especially women.
Well, also I imagine because oftentimes, or usually, women are not the ones who are in the position of power. And so much in the news media focus on the official declarations, the politicians, the history of what's happening from above, whereas the women oftentimes are working below, like the girl that you mentioned who was looking through the rubble and found her mother. So that in itself would be kind of a different perspective, no?
Definitely, but look, this whole thing is a struggle, and we face a lot of resistance. And we're still not in a place to be able to say this perspective has opened up, this is how it is. Even though we've advanced, again, I was in Cuba. We founded the Dominican Network of Journalists with Gender Perspective, which still exists, and there are some prizes and recognitions that open up. But this whole thing is made up for struggle, resistance, and confrontation. It's not easy, and well, it's never been easy for women.
Well, I want to go back to that question that we talked about a little at the beginning. So this resistance, do you find it with editors? Do you find it with the companies themselves in the media where women work? Where's like the core of this resistance that makes it so difficult to get some of these stories out?
The resistance comes from society itself. That's where we have to confront it. It's not just businessmen, it's not even just their colleagues, both men and women. Yes, women too. It's not just that. That the resistance has to open up to new perspectives in the creative sense. This can't be a routine thing. It has to be a struggle based on this women's creativity. And also, the men who are making the effort to open space up for equality within media. But society is going to keep pushing back. Other women are going to resist the change, our colleagues are going to keep resisting, and many of them will see some of us as a threat. That's what's going to happen,
A threat
and it's
to the
already
status
happening.
quo.
Today I saw a headline in a newspaper that was talking about aspects of femicide. And I said, amazing, they're just using that word in a headline. So little by little you see the things change. And the same thing is happening in Cuba too. Although there is also that pushback, that ignorance, it's the reality. And in Dominican Republic too. It's not a battle that we've won yet, not at all. It's barely started, but it's started and we can do a lot more, without a doubt.
Well, speaking of doing much more, let's talk about some of the things that you've done as a pioneer in this field of gender and communications. We talked about the formation of networks, like the network of journalists with a gender perspective. Tell us about how these work and what kind of advances they've been able to make.
Look, when I taught workshops about this issue, I said that these things are tools to build power. Why these tools? How do we have to prepare ourselves? What skills do we need? What theories? What advanced concepts do we need to build the power that we need? You know, there's a discipline called advocacy that we've worked with a lot, and it teaches these skills. And we've done some workshops both in the Dominican Republic and even in Cuba, but not as much as in Cuba as in the Dominican Republic. That's what we've been able to do. Advocacy and gender perspective within communication are tools for building power. So, well, how? Alliances. We have to build alliances. Without alliances, we'll get nowhere.
Like with who? With what organizations?
Sure, of course.
With all organizations.
Exactly. Alliances and with other groups. And with, of course, with other organizations, with other countries, and our colleagues from other countries, because these alliances need to be international. And because there is so much energy in other countries, it's not that hard to connect, to get together and join our forces and share what I call our tools to build power. Because that's how we're going to be able to advance, by getting into work in television, for example, where they still haven't accepted that women are equal and that women have power. We know if you can get into that area, like, look what you're doing, Telesur, it's a great example. And I also love Telesur. I watch it all the time in Cuba, in terms of this perspective. I'm not saying that we've won everything. I know that there are places where progress still seems a little bit slow. That's true. But there are advances. Things are changing.
It's always a question of power.
Yes, of course.
And awareness as well.
It's power, it's power.
And awareness not only of the society of the need to have this perspective, but I find as a journalist that I have to remind myself oftentimes, wait a minute, am I looking at this from all perspectives, including a gender perspective? How can I do more to open up the way we see things? Because there's a certain inertia about the status quo that's easy to fall into. I don't know if that happens to you.
Look, it seems to me that the first thing we have to achieve is that women understand, that women themselves, and of course women communicators, understand a little better what exactly a gender perspective is, and that they get training for that. Because, and I'm sure you have the same experience, that women say, no, I don't need that. What is that? You know, they imagine stupid things like, we hate men, that kind of rubbish that makes no sense. But the women journalists themselves have to feel that this is their responsibility and see how far they can go to advance this perspective and why it is important. If we don't fight, if we don't make sure that there's equality built into our own projects and plans, everything will be a lot harder.
It's a job that we have to do, really. No one's
It's
going to
a
do it
job.
for us.
That's right. It's a big job, of course.
Yeah. Well, besides the networks, and you talk about we're giving workshops to women communicators precisely for this reason, to teach them how to make a gender perspective more evident, to open up more space within their own work for this. And not just to women in the media, but also to women who communicate in many other sectors. For example, what other sectors have participated in these workshops on gender perspective?
Well, look,
Yeah?
health, the men and women who work in health, teachers, men and women, and professionals, of course.
We teach children.
University teachers, yes, of course. And yes, elementary school teachers, and in fact, in every space of reality and in any workplace, there should be a gender perspective. I have a very simple example, very simple, so people are at least familiar with this. People who don't understand it, so that they can understand what it is. I say, let's look at a table in a house at dinner time or something like that, supposing that the family eats together, which is another issue. The families don't always eat together. So I asked them, where does that dad sit? Where does the mom sit? Where do the kids sit? Who gets served first? And what do they get served? There's a gender perspective there. And it's easy to understand. And that's a very basic example that you can give so that people realize that
it's a
this is
classic
valid.
scene of patriarchy.
Exactly, of course, yes.
And
But the thing is, you have to start there with simple things to be able to get other concepts and theories.
And you find a lot of people just with that scene go, oh,
Of course,
yeah.
of course.
and see
It
the ways in which
astonishes a lot of people. Well, yes, that's true, and they realize it.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think we're making progress? I mean, because I've been shocked, I think everyone in the world has been shocked recently with cases like Bolsonaro in Brazil, with Donald Trump in the United States, where all of a sudden there's an anti-women language that's become almost legitimated in politics. Do you think there's a backlash?
Look, Laura, I think that we're in a time where we're going backwards. But I also think that still, in Brazil, in the United States, all over, there is that the resistance, the people who want to fight back against this reality, are regrouping. Not just me, I'm sure you also know a lot of women in the United States who are fighting this, organizing marches, doing other things.
And young women.
Yes, and in Brazil too. In Brazil there's a very strong movement, and also in almost every country. In the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean, there is an eruption of revolutionary struggle through the massive presence of, well, if not massive, at least large presence of women with sensibility and consciousness, and men too. Because we can't leave men out of this struggle. Men have a lot of men understand, a lot of men join us, but of course you have to explain it, you have to explain things, you have to repeat things, you have to build theories, you have to find these examples from daily life, because daily life is where change happens. It's in daily life, and that's where we need to work and make a real effort. Also, of course, in our workplaces.
Right, because as communicators, as women communicators, the message has to reach into daily life through television, through newspapers. How can we make that as strong as possible in these times when we are seeing certain steps backwards? How can we really reach into daily life when we're seeing kind of movements that are moving in the opposite direction? It's a big question, but it's
yes, I was going to say that it's a question that neither you nor I really know the answer to, and probably not a lot of people do know. But I think that as we keep advancing, we are moving towards a confrontation with that reality and finding the answer to that question.
And looking for some very succinct kind of messages. We also live in a society that's gotten used to sound bites, gotten used to messages that are very brief, that are very, that are very simplistic lots of times. We have to learn how to kind of play those games as well, no?
Yes, we have to simplify all of this so that it gets to everyone. But we have to do that without losing the perspective of what our goal is, what our goals are. I think that we are in a very important moment and we need to go forward every day.
When you get together with other women journalists in the regional networks that you have, what are some of the things that are at the top of the agenda lately?
Well, for example, language, building messages, issues about health, violence. Violence is present everywhere. Clearly violence against women. But not just against women, also against children. We need equality in education. I think that those are at least 5 issues on the agenda that we need to work on.
So we have, on one hand, the way in which we communicate, changing the way in which we communicate with non-sexist language, watching the kinds of terms that are used and what relationships of power between the sexes are reflected there. And on the other hand, a series of issues themselves that have to do with violence, including violence against women, looking at health issues, how they affect women, but how they affect the population in general. So we have kind of two tracks on which many of these networks are working, right?
If you want to talk about an issue that is maybe most important for women, it's probably making our own decisions about our bodies.
Another area where we're seeing some serious
and what's
threats.
happening, of course.
Yeah.
Look at what's happening.
Well, Mirta, thanks so much for being with us. We've come to the end of the program. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you. Thanks again.
And for me as well. It was a pleasure for me to be here in Talasur with you.
And thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.